Tonight, as your mind begins to settle and the world outside grows quiet, let me take you on a gentle journey through one of humanity's most enduring quests, the search for wisdom, the love of knowledge, the very foundation of how we understand ourselves and our place in this vast universe. Philosophy, but not the kind you might remember from dusty textbooks or intimidating lecture halls. Instead, let's explore how it all began in the ancient world, where curious minds first dared to ask the questions that still keep us awake at night. Picture this. It's the 6th century before the Common Era. The Mediterranean world is alive with trade, ideas flowing like water between distant shores. In the Greek colonies along the coast of what we now call Turkey, something remarkable is happening. For the first time in recorded history, human beings are beginning to look at the world around them and ask not just what, but why. Not just how do we appease the gods, but what is the fundamental nature of reality itself? This is where our story truly begins. Not with grand temples or mighty armies, but with a handful of individuals who possessed perhaps the most dangerous trait imaginable: insatiable curiosity. They lived in a world where every natural phenomenon was explained through the actions of gods and spirits. Thunder was Zeus expressing his anger. The changing seasons reflected Demeter's grief over her lost daughter. Earthquakes meant Poseidon was restless beneath the waves. Yet these early thinkers began to wonder if perhaps there might be something more, something deeper, something that could be understood through reason rather than simply accepted through faith. The word philosophy itself comes to us from the Greek, philosophia. Philos, meaning love, and sophia, meaning wisdom. Love of wisdom. But what exactly did this mean to those first philosophers? It wasn't the kind of love we might feel for a person or even for a beautiful piece of music. It was something more profound, a burning desire to understand the underlying principles that governed everything from the movement of the stars to the growth of a seed. A recognition that beneath the apparent chaos and complexity of existence, there might be patterns, laws, fundamental truths waiting to be discovered. The traditional story tells us that philosophy began with a man named Thales, living in the prosperous city of Miletus. Now, Thales was not what you might picture when you think of a philosopher. He wasn't sitting cross-legged under a tree, contemplating his navel. He was a practical man, a merchant, someone who understood the importance of navigation and trade. He studied the stars, not for mystical purposes, but because understanding their movements was crucial for safe travel across the Mediterranean. He observed the annual flooding of the Nile River and recognized that this natural cycle was what made Egyptian agriculture so remarkably productive. But here's what made Thales revolutionary. He began to ask whether all of these diverse phenomena might have something in common. Water, he proposed, might be the fundamental substance from which everything else emerges. Think about it for a moment. Water can become vapor, rising to form clouds. It can freeze into solid ice. It's essential for all life. It shapes the landscape through erosion and deposition. To Thales, it seemed reasonable to suppose that this remarkably versatile substance might be the basic building block of reality itself. Now, from our modern perspective, this might seem almost quaint. We know about atoms and molecules, about the periodic table of elements, about the complex chemistry that underlies all matter. But try to imagine the intellectual courage it took to make such a proposal in a world dominated by mythological explanations. Thales wasn't just suggesting a new answer to an old question. He was suggesting an entirely new way of asking questions. Instead of, which god is responsible for this phenomenon? He was asking, what natural principle might explain this phenomenon? This shift in thinking was absolutely revolutionary. It represented the birth of what we might call rational inquiry. The idea that the human mind, through careful observation and logical reasoning, might be able to uncover truths about the nature of reality. It was the beginning of science, the beginning of systematic philosophy, the beginning of a new relationship between human consciousness and the world it sought to understand. But Thales was just the beginning. His student Anaximander took these ideas even further. If everything comes from water, Anaximander reasoned, then what does water come from? There must be something even more fundamental, something that underlies not just the specific substances we observe, but the very capacity for change itself. He called this ultimate principle the apeiron, which means something like the unlimited or the boundless. It was neither water, nor air, nor fire, nor earth, but something more basic than any of these, something that could give rise to all the diversity we observe in the world while remaining itself unchanged. Anaximander's insight was profound. He was recognizing that if we're going to explain change, we need something that doesn't itself change. If we're going to explain diversity, we need some underlying unity. If we're going to make sense of the apparent chaos of experience, we need to postulate some deeper order. These insights would echo through the centuries, influencing thinkers from Plato to Spinoza, to modern physicists searching for a unified field theory. And then came Anaximenes, who proposed yet another candidate for the fundamental substance: air. Air, he argued, could account for all the changes we observe through processes of condensation and rarefaction. When air becomes denser, it turns into water, then into earth. When it becomes less dense, it turns into fire. Everything we see around us is simply air in different states of compression or expansion. Again, this might seem primitive to us, but think about the conceptual sophistication involved. Anaximenes was proposing that qualitative differences, all the rich variety of substances and phenomena we observe, might actually be quantitative differences in a single underlying reality. These three thinkers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, are often called the Milesian school, after their city of origin, but their influence extended far beyond the boundaries of their particular community. They had established a new tradition of inquiry, a new way of approaching the fundamental questions of existence. They had shown that it was possible to think systematically about the nature of reality, to propose theories that could be debated and refined, to use human reason as a tool for understanding the cosmos. As word of these ideas spread throughout the Greek world, other thinkers began to develop their own approaches to these fundamental questions. In the Greek colonies of southern Italy, a figure emerged who would take philosophy in an entirely different direction. Pythagoras was his name, and while we often remember him today for a mathematical theorem about right triangles, his contributions to early philosophy were far more wide-ranging and, in many ways, far more mysterious. Pythagoras founded what was essentially a religious community, a group of followers who lived according to strict rules and devoted themselves to the pursuit of wisdom and spiritual purification. But their approach to understanding reality was unique. While the Milesians had focused on material substances, water or air or the boundless, the Pythagoreans became convinced that the fundamental nature of reality was mathematical. Number, they believed, was the key to understanding everything from the harmony of musical intervals to the movements of the celestial bodies. This was an extraordinary insight. The Pythagoreans discovered that musical harmony could be expressed in precise mathematical ratios. A string vibrating at twice the frequency of another string produces a note exactly 1 octave higher. The intervals that sound most pleasing to the human ear correspond to simple mathematical relationships. From this discovery, they extrapolated a much grander vision. Perhaps the entire cosmos was structured according to mathematical principles. Perhaps the movements of the planets, the cycles of the seasons, the very fabric of reality itself could be understood through number and proportion. The Pythagorean vision of a mathematically ordered cosmos would prove to be one of the most influential ideas in the Plato's theory of forms, influence history of human thought. It would inspire the development of astronomy from Ptolemy to Copernicus to Kepler, and ultimately contribute to the mathematical foundations of modern physics. The idea that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, as Galileo would later put it, has its roots in these early Pythagorean insights. But the Pythagoreans went even further. They developed elaborate theories about the transmigration of souls, the purification of consciousness through philosophical contemplation, and the ultimate goal of human life as the achievement of harmony with the cosmic order. Philosophy for them was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a way of life, a spiritual discipline that could transform the very nature of the person who practiced it. This tension between philosophy as rational inquiry and philosophy as spiritual practice would remain a constant theme throughout the ancient world. Were these early thinkers primarily interested in understanding the physical structure of the universe, or were they seeking something more transcendent? Were they proto-scientists, or were they essentially religious figures? The answer, as we'll see, is probably both. As these ideas continued to develop and spread, they encountered new challenges and generated new insights. In the Greek city of Ephesus, a figure emerged who would become famous for his cryptic sayings and his doctrine of eternal flux. Heraclitus, known even in antiquity as the Dark One because of the difficulty of his teachings, proposed that change itself was the fundamental principle of reality. "You cannot step twice into the same river," he famously observed, because new waters are always flowing around you. But Heraclitus wasn't simply saying that everything changes. His insight was more subtle and more profound. He was suggesting that the very identity of things depends on their capacity for change. The river is a river precisely because it's constantly in motion. Remove the flow, and you no longer have a river, but merely a collection of stagnant water. Similarly, our own identities as human beings depend on the constant processes of change that constitute our lives. We are not static entities that happen to change. We are processes of change that maintain temporary patterns of stability. This was a remarkable anticipation of ideas that would not be fully developed until the 20th century. Modern physics tells us that what we perceive as solid matter is actually composed of particles in constant motion, that even the most stable-seeming objects are engaged in continuous processes of energy exchange with their environment. Biology reveals that living organisms maintain their identity through constant processes of metabolism, growth, and adaptation. Heraclitus, working with nothing but careful observation and logical reasoning, had intuited something fundamental about the dynamic nature of reality. But Heraclitus also recognized that within this constant flux, there was an underlying order, a divine principle he called the Logos. This wasn't chaos or random change, but change according to a rational pattern, a cosmic law that governed all transformations. Fire, he believed, was the most appropriate symbol for this principle, because fire is simultaneously creative and destructive, constantly consuming fuel while maintaining its own form, transforming everything it touches while remaining essentially fire. The Logos, for Heraclitus, was both immanent in the world and transcendent of it. It was the reason why change followed predictable patterns, why day followed night, why seasons cycled in their eternal rhythm, why conflict and opposition gave rise to harmony rather than mere chaos. Most humans, he argued, live their lives asleep to this deeper reality. They see only the surface changes and miss the underlying unity that connects all apparent opposites. This teaching about the unity of opposites became central to Heraclitean philosophy. Hot and cold, wet and dry, life and death, these aren't separate realities but aspects of a single cosmic process. What we call death is simply life transforming into a different mode of being. What we experience as conflict is actually the tension that maintains the dynamic balance of the universe. The path up and the path down, he cryptically observed, are one and the same path. While Heraclitus was developing his philosophy of flux in Ephesus, another school of thought was emerging in the Greek colonies of southern Italy that would take philosophy in almost the opposite direction. Parmenides of Elea would argue that change itself was impossible, that what we perceive as motion and transformation is merely an illusion created by the limitations of our senses. Parmenides approached philosophy not through observation of the natural world, but through pure logical reasoning. He began with what seemed like the most basic possible truth: something exists. From this starting point, he constructed an elaborate argument designed to show that whatever exists must be eternal, unchanging, indivisible, and uniform. If something truly exists, he reasoned, it cannot have come into being, because that would mean it previously did not exist, which would be nothing, and nothing cannot give rise to something. Similarly, it cannot pass out of existence, because that would mean it becomes nothing, which is impossible. Furthermore, if something exists, it must exist completely and uniformly. There cannot be degrees of existence, places where it exists more or less, because any such variation would introduce an element of non-being, which again is impossible. The logical conclusion, according to Parmenides, is that reality consists of a single, eternal, unchanging, homogeneous sphere of being, perfect and complete in itself. This conclusion directly contradicted everything that human experience seemed to reveal about the world. We see constant change, diversity, movement, birth and death. How could Parmenides maintain that all of this was illusion? His answer was to make a sharp distinction between the way of truth, accessible only through reason, and the way of opinion based on the unreliable testimony of the senses. The senses, he argued, are fundamentally deceptive. They show us a world of apparent multiplicity and change that cannot actually exist if we think carefully about what existence really means. The impact of Parmenides on subsequent philosophy cannot be overstated. He had raised the stakes of philosophical inquiry to an almost unbearable level. No longer could philosophers simply propose theories about the fundamental substance of reality and expect them to be accepted as plausible. Now, every theory would have to confront the rigorous logical challenges that Parmenides had established. How can you account for change without falling into logical contradiction? How can you explain the relationship between the one and the many? How can you reconcile the demands of reason with the evidence of experience? These questions would drive philosophical development for centuries. Plato would eventually propose his theory of forms as a way of preserving both the Parmenidean insights about eternal being and the Heraclitean insights about constant becoming. Aristotle would develop his sophisticated analysis of different types of change and different modes of being. But even today, in our most advanced scientific theories, we can still detect echoes of these ancient puzzles about the relationship between permanence and change, unity and diversity. The followers of Parmenides, particularly Zeno of Elea, developed a series of ingenious paradoxes designed to support their master's conclusions about the impossibility of motion and change. The most famous of these involves Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles, the swift-footed warrior, races against a tortoise, giving the slow creature a head start. Logic seems to suggest that Achilles should easily overtake the tortoise, but Zeno argued that this is impossible. Before Achilles can reach the tortoise's starting position, the tortoise will have moved a bit further. Before Achilles can reach that new position, the tortoise will have moved again. Since this process can be repeated infinitely, Achilles can never actually catch up despite his superior speed. This paradox might seem like mere cleverness, but it actually points to deep mathematical and philosophical problems about the nature of infinity, continuity, and the relationship between mathematical description and physical reality. Modern mathematics has developed sophisticated tools for dealing with infinite series and limits, but the fundamental questions that Zeno raised about the conceptual foundations of motion and change remain active areas of research in physics and philosophy. While these debates about the ultimate nature of reality were developing in the Greek colonies, the intellectual center of the Greek world was beginning to shift toward Athens. The 5th century before the Common Era was a time of remarkable cultural flowering in this city-state. Democracy was emerging as a new form of political organization. Tragic and comic drama were reaching unprecedented heights of artistic achievement. Architecture and sculpture were developing the classical forms that would influence Western art for millennia. Into this vibrant intellectual environment came a new type of thinker, one who would redirect philosophical inquiry away from abstract questions about the fundamental nature of reality toward more practical concerns about human life and society. These were the Sophists, and their approach to philosophy was radically different from anything that had come before. The Sophists were primarily teachers, and they were the first philosophers to charge fees for their instruction. This immediately set them apart from earlier thinkers, who had generally been wealthy enough to pursue wisdom as a leisure activity. The Sophists, by contrast, were professionals who made their living by teaching young men the skills they needed to succeed in the democratic political system of Athens. This meant primarily the art of rhetoric, the ability to speak persuasively in public assemblies and law courts. But the Sophists were not merely concerned with practical techniques of persuasion. They developed sophisticated theories about language, knowledge, and human nature that challenged many of the assumptions of earlier philosophers. Protagoras, perhaps the most famous of the Sophists, declared that man is the measure of all things. What he meant by this was that there are no absolute truths or values that exist independently of human judgment. What seems true or good or beautiful to one person may seem false or bad or ugly to another, and there is no objective standard by which to determine who is correct. This relativistic approach extended to ethics and politics, as well as to questions about the nature of reality. The Sophists argued that moral values and political institutions were not based on eternal principles or divine commands, but were simply human conventions that varied from one society to another. What was considered virtuous behavior in Athens might be considered shameful in Sparta, and vice versa. Justice, they suggested, was nothing more than the interest of the stronger party, the values imposed by whoever happened to hold power at any given time. These ideas were deeply disturbing to many Athenians, who worried that sophistic teaching was undermining the moral and religious foundations of their society. If there were no absolute truths or values, if everything was merely a matter of human convention and opinion, then what was to prevent complete moral chaos? Why should anyone obey the laws or honor the gods if these were merely arbitrary human constructions rather than reflections of cosmic order? The Sophists had a ready answer to these concerns. They argued that human conventions, even if they were not based on absolute truths, still served important social functions. Laws and moral codes helped maintain order and cooperation within communities. Religious practices provided comfort and meaning for individuals facing the uncertainties of life. The fact that these institutions were human creations rather than divine commands did not make them worthless. It simply meant that humans had the responsibility to evaluate and modify them as circumstances required. This pragmatic approach to truth and value would prove to be enormously influential in the development of later philosophy, particularly in the modern period. But it also provoked a strong reaction from those who believed that philosophy should be concerned with discovering absolute truths, rather than merely analyzing human conventions. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in the history of ideas between the sophistic emphasis on relativism and pragmatism and a new kind of philosophical approach that would insist on the possibility of genuine knowledge and objective truth. It was into this intellectual ferment that there stepped a figure who would transform philosophy once again, not through developing new theories about the nature of reality, but through developing new methods of inquiry. He claimed to know nothing, yet he spent his life examining the knowledge claims of others. He wrote no books, founded no school, charged no fees for his teaching, yet he became perhaps the most influential philosopher who ever lived. His name was Socrates, and he would change everything not by providing answers, but by perfecting the art of asking questions. Picture him wandering through the streets of Athens, approaching anyone who would listen, from politicians to poets, from craftsmen to military generals. He would engage them in conversation, not to show off his own knowledge, but to examine theirs. And what he discovered, again and again, was that people who claimed to possess wisdom often could not explain what they meant by the words they used so confidently. Take the concept of justice, for instance. Everyone in Athens talked about justice. Politicians promised to deliver it. Judges claimed to dispense it. Citizens demanded it. But when Socrates asked them to define what justice actually was, their confident assertions quickly crumbled into confusion and contradiction. One person might say that justice means giving each person what they deserve, but then Socrates would ask, what exactly do people deserve, and who gets to decide? Another might claim that justice means following the laws, but Socrates would wonder, what if the laws themselves are unjust? Can an unjust law create justice simply by being obeyed? This wasn't mere intellectual game-playing. Socrates believed that most human suffering came from ignorance, from acting on the basis of unexamined assumptions and half-understood concepts. If people truly understood what virtue was, he argued, they would naturally choose to be virtuous. If they genuinely comprehended what justice required, they would act justly. The problem was that most people lived their entire lives without ever seriously questioning their most basic beliefs about right and wrong, good and bad, true and false. The method that Socrates developed for exposing this ignorance came to be known as the elenchus, from the Greek word meaning to cross-examine or to test. It was deceptively simple. Socrates would begin by asking someone to define a concept they claimed to understand. When they offered a definition, he would test it by proposing examples or counterexamples that seemed to contradict or complicate their initial explanation. This would lead to a revised definition, which would in turn be subjected to further questioning, and so on, until the original confident assertion had been revealed as confused or contradictory. What made this process so powerful was not that Socrates had better definitions to offer. In fact, he consistently claimed that he knew nothing at all. The power lay in the recognition that came to his conversation partners when they realized that they too knew far less than they had thought. This moment of recognizing one's own ignorance, Socrates believed, was the beginning of genuine wisdom. It was only when you understood how much you didn't know that you could begin the serious work of learning. But Socrates wasn't content to leave people in a state of confusion and doubt. The recognition of ignorance was meant to be the first step in a longer journey toward understanding. Through continued questioning and examination, Through testing ideas against experience and logic, it might be possible to move beyond mere opinion toward genuine knowledge. This process required enormous intellectual humility, the willingness to abandon cherished beliefs when they proved to be unfounded, and the courage to follow an argument wherever it might lead, even if the destination was uncomfortable or unexpected. The Socratic approach to philosophy represented a fundamental shift in how human beings thought about the pursuit of truth. Earlier, philosophers had typically begun with confident assertions about the nature of reality, and then attempted to construct elaborate theoretical systems to support their initial insights. Socrates, by contrast, began with questions and used those questions to reveal the inadequacy of conventional thinking. He showed that genuine philosophical progress required not the accumulation of more and more theories, but the careful examination and testing of the concepts we already use every day. This method was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it showed that anyone, regardless of their social status or formal education, could participate in philosophical inquiry. All that was required was the willingness to think carefully and honestly about fundamental questions. Terrifying because it revealed that most of what people took for granted about morality, politics, and the meaning of life was built on foundations of sand. The impact of Socratic questioning extended far beyond the specific individuals he encountered in the streets of Athens. His student Plato would develop these insights into a comprehensive philosophical system that attempted to ground human knowledge in eternal and unchanging truths. Plato's student Aristotle would create an even more systematic approach to understanding reality, one that would dominate Western thought for over 1,000 years. But the Socratic spirit of questioning and examination would remain at the heart of philosophical inquiry, reminding later thinkers that the unexamined life, as Socrates put it, was not worth living. The political implications of Socratic philosophy were profound and ultimately dangerous. In a democracy like Athens, political decisions were made by citizens who gathered in the assembly to debate and vote on matters of public policy. The effectiveness of this system depended on the assumption that ordinary people could make reasonable judgments about complex issues. But if Socrates was right that most people didn't really understand the concepts they used so confidently, then what did this say about the wisdom of democratic decision-making? Furthermore, many of the young men who gathered around Socrates and learned his methods of questioning came from aristocratic families that were already suspicious of democratic governance. When these young aristocrats began applying Socratic techniques to examine the beliefs and assumptions of their fellow citizens, it often seemed like they were attacking the very foundations of Athenian society. Some of Socrates' associates, including his student Critias, would later become involved in anti-democratic political movements that sought to overthrow the Athenian government. It's not difficult to understand why many Athenians began to view Socrates as a dangerous influence. Here was a man who claimed to be seeking truth and wisdom, but whose primary effect seemed to be to undermine people's confidence in their most basic beliefs and values. He professed to know nothing, yet he seemed to delight in exposing the ignorance of respected citizens. He claimed to be serving the god Apollo by encouraging people to examine their lives, yet his activities appeared to be corroding the religious and moral foundations of the community. The tension between Socratic philosophy and conventional Athenian values came to a head in 399 BCE, when Socrates was brought to trial on charges of corrupting the youth and impiety toward the gods. The specific accusations were probably pretexts for deeper political and cultural anxieties about the effects of philosophical questioning on social stability. Socrates could easily have avoided conviction by agreeing to leave Athens or by moderating his activities. Instead, he used his trial as an opportunity to defend not only himself, but the entire philosophical way of life. According to Plato's account of the trial, Socrates argued that far from harming Athens, his questioning activities had been a divine gift to the city. Like a gadfly stinging a sluggish horse into motion, he had tried to rouse his fellow citizens from their intellectual and moral complacency. The examined life, he maintained, was the only life truly worth living for a human being, and a city that silenced those who encouraged such examination would be impoverishing itself spiritually and intellectually. The jury was not convinced. Socrates was found guilty by a narrow margin and sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. Even then, he could have escaped. His friends had arranged for him to flee Athens and live in exile, but Socrates chose to remain and accept his sentence, arguing that doing otherwise would contradict everything he had taught about the importance of living according to one's principles, regardless of the consequences. The death of Socrates sent shockwaves through the philosophical community of Athens and beyond. Here was a man who had devoted his entire life to the pursuit of wisdom and virtue, who had never harmed anyone, who had served his city faithfully as a soldier and citizen, yet who had been executed essentially for asking too many questions. The tragedy seemed to confirm the worst fears about the conflict between philosophy and politics, between the demands of truth and the requirements of social stability. But the death of Socrates also ensured his immortality. His student Plato would spend the rest of his life developing and defending Socratic insights, creating dialogues in which Socrates appeared as the main character, continuing to ask his penetrating questions even from beyond the grave. These dialogues would become the foundation for much of subsequent Western philosophy, ensuring that the Socratic method of inquiry would survive and flourish long after the man himself had been silenced. The example of Socrates also established a powerful model for what it meant to be a philosopher. Philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise or a professional academic discipline, but a way of life that demanded complete commitment and integrity. The philosopher was someone who had chosen to prioritize the pursuit of truth over wealth, fame, comfort, or even personal safety. This ideal of the philosopher as a kind of secular saint, devoted to wisdom above all else, would inspire countless later thinkers and continue to shape our understanding of what philosophy is meant to accomplish. As news of Socrates' death spread throughout the Greek world, it catalyzed a new phase in the development of philosophical thought. The questions that Socrates had raised about knowledge, virtue, and the good life demanded more systematic answers than his method of questioning alone could provide. His students and their students would spend the next several centuries attempting to construct positive philosophical systems that could withstand Socratic scrutiny while still maintaining the spirit of critical inquiry that he had embodied. But even as philosophy became more systematic and academic, the Socratic legacy remained as a constant reminder that no theory, no matter how elegant or comprehensive, should be accepted without careful examination. The questions that Socrates had asked about the fundamental concepts of human life, justice, courage, wisdom, love, death, remained as urgent and perplexing as ever. And his example continued to suggest that the pursuit of answers to these questions was not just an interesting intellectual hobby, but the most important work that a human being could undertake. In the generations following Socrates' death, Greek philosophy would reach unprecedented heights of systematic development. Great schools would be founded, comprehensive theories would be developed, and the intellectual tools would be forged that would shape human thought for millennia to come. Yet at the heart of all these developments, the spirit of Socratic questioning would continue to operate, ensuring that philosophy remained not just a collection of doctrines to be memorized, but a living practice of critical inquiry into the deepest questions of human existence. The revolution that had begun with Thales' simple question about the fundamental nature of reality had now evolved into something far more complex and demanding. Philosophy was no longer just about understanding the physical world, but about understanding ourselves, our knowledge, our values, our purposes, our place in the cosmic order. And the method for pursuing this understanding had become not just observation and reasoning, but the rigorous examination of our most basic assumptions about what it means to be human. This transformation of philosophy from cosmic speculation to rigorous self-examination would set the stage for developments that would reshape not just Greek thought, but the entire trajectory of human intellectual history. As we settle deeper into this exploration, let me guide you through the remarkable flowering that emerged from these Socratic seeds, a period when philosophy would reach heights of systematic brilliance that still illuminate our understanding today. The execution of Socrates created a profound crisis for his followers. Here was their beloved teacher, the wisest man they had ever known, silenced by the very city he had sought to serve. The questions he had raised remained unanswered, his method of inquiry seemingly validated by his martyrdom, yet also threatened with extinction. It fell to his students to preserve and develop his legacy, to transform his practice of questioning into something that could survive in a world often hostile to uncomfortable truths. Among these students, one figure would emerge whose influence on subsequent thought is almost impossible to overstate. Aristocles, known to us by his nickname Plato, meaning broad, perhaps referring to his physical build or the breadth of his intellectual interests. Plato had witnessed firsthand the trial and death of Socrates, and this traumatic experience would shape everything he wrote for the rest of his long life. How could a just man be condemned by an unjust society? How could truth be defeated by opinion? How could wisdom be overcome by ignorance and prejudice? These questions drove Plato to develop what would become one of the most comprehensive and influential philosophical systems ever created. But unlike earlier thinkers who had presented their ideas in treatises or poems, Plato chose a unique literary form for his philosophical works, the dialogue. In these conversations, usually featuring Socrates as the main character, Plato could preserve the dynamic, questioning spirit of his teacher, while gradually developing positive philosophical doctrines that went far beyond anything Socrates himself had explicitly taught. The early dialogues capture something of the historical Socrates, showing him in action with various Athenian citizens, exposing their ignorance while claiming to know nothing himself. But as Plato's philosophical vision matured, the character of Socrates in the dialogues began to articulate increasingly sophisticated theories about the nature of reality, knowledge, and the human soul. It's often impossible to determine where the historical Socrates ends and Plato's own philosophical innovations begin, and perhaps that's exactly as Plato intended it. Central to Plato's mature philosophy was his famous theory of forms, an attempt to solve some of the deepest puzzles that earlier philosophers had raised about the relationship between permanence and change, unity and diversity, appearance and reality. The world we experience through our senses, Plato argued, is a world of constant flux, where nothing remains the same from moment to moment. Yet our minds seem capable of grasping concepts that are stable and universal. We can recognize justice in many different situations, despite the fact that no two just actions are exactly alike. We can identify triangular shapes, even though no physical triangle is perfectly triangular. How is this possible? Plato's answer was revolutionary. He proposed that in addition to the physical world of particular things, there exists another realm, a realm of eternal, unchanging forms or ideas. The form of justice is perfect justice itself, not any particular just action, but the standard by which all just actions can be recognized and evaluated. The form of triangle is perfect triangularity, the eternal pattern that all triangular things imperfectly copy or participate in. This theory solved several philosophical problems at once. It explained how we could have genuine knowledge in a world of constant change by locating the objects of knowledge in an eternal realm beyond the reach of sensory flux. It explained how language and thought were possible by providing universal standards that particular things could exemplify to greater or lesser degrees. It provided a foundation for objective moral and aesthetic values by grounding them in eternal forms of good and beauty. But the theory of forms also raised new and difficult questions. If there are two realms of reality, how do they relate to each other? How can eternal, unchanging forms be connected to temporal, changing particulars? How can the human soul, trapped in a physical body, gain access to knowledge of these transcendent realities? Plato spent much of his philosophical career wrestling with these problems, developing increasingly sophisticated accounts of the relationship between the world of forms and the world of appearances. One of his most famous attempts to explain this relationship appears in the Republic, in the allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in an underground cave, facing a wall on which shadows are projected by objects carried past a fire behind them. The prisoners mistake these shadows for reality itself, having never seen the actual objects that cast them. Now imagine one prisoner being freed and dragged up into the sunlight, where he discovers the true nature of reality. Initially, the light is painful and confusing, but gradually he comes to understand that what he had taken for reality was merely shadows of shadows. This allegory operates on multiple levels. On one level, it's about the philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge, from the world of sensory appearance to the intellectual vision of eternal truth. The shadows on the cave wall represent the illusions of ordinary experience, while the sunlight represents the form of the good, the ultimate source of all truth and reality. The philosopher who achieves this vision has a moral obligation to return to the cave and help others make the same journey, even though they may initially reject and even attack him for challenging their comfortable illusions. On another level, the allegory is about education and the proper ordering of society. The philosopher kings who should rule Plato's ideal state are those who have made the journey from the cave to the sunlight and back again. They have seen the truth about justice and the good life, and they are therefore qualified to organize society according to eternal principles, rather than mere human convention or the arbitrary exercise of power. This vision of philosopher kings ruling an ideal state was Plato's response to the political crisis that had claimed the life of Socrates. Democracy, he argued, was the rule of opinion over knowledge, of appearance over reality. It was a system that allowed the ignorant many to overrule the knowledgeable few, that valued persuasive rhetoric over genuine wisdom. Only when political power was combined with philosophical knowledge could justice truly be achieved in human society. The Republic presents Plato's detailed blueprint for such a society, organized according to the principle that each person should perform the function for which they are naturally best suited. The guardians, selected and trained from childhood, would protect the state and eventually rule it. The auxiliaries would serve as soldiers and administrators. The producers would engage in agriculture, crafts, and trade. Justice in the state would consist in each class performing its proper function without interfering with the others. This political vision was paralleled by Plato's Psychology, his account of the human soul. Just as the state has three classes, the soul has three parts: reason, which should rule; spirit, which should obey reason and help control appetite; and appetite, which should be governed by the other two. Justice in the individual consists in the proper ordering of these three parts, with reason ruling over spirit and appetite, just as the philosopher kings should rule over the guardians and producers in the ideal state. This psychological theory had profound implications for Plato's understanding of ethics and education. Virtue was not simply a matter of following rules or conforming to social expectations, but of achieving the proper internal harmony of the soul. This harmony could only be achieved through the right kind of education, one that developed all aspects of human nature in their proper proportions. Physical training would strengthen the body and discipline the appetites. Musical and literary education would cultivate the emotions and train the spirit. Mathematical and philosophical study would develop the rational faculty and ultimately lead to knowledge of the eternal forms. The educational program Plato outlined in the Republic was extraordinarily demanding, extending over decades and culminating in the direct intellectual vision of the form of the good. Only a few individuals in any generation would be capable of completing this journey, but they would emerge from it transformed, possessing genuine knowledge rather than mere opinion, capable of ruling others because they had first learned to rule themselves. This emphasis on self-knowledge and self-mastery connected Plato's political philosophy with the Socratic injunction to know thyself. But Plato went far beyond Socrates in developing a detailed account of what such self-knowledge involved. The soul, he argued, was not merely the principle of life in the body, but an eternal entity that existed before birth and would continue to exist after death. Learning was actually a process of recollection, in which the soul remembered truths it had known in its previous existence in the realm of forms. This theory of recollection was dramatically illustrated in the Meno, where Socrates guides an uneducated slave boy to discover geometric truths through questioning alone. The boy had never studied mathematics, yet through careful questioning he was able to arrive at correct conclusions about the relationships between squares and their diagonals. How was this possible, unless the soul already possessed this knowledge and needed only to be reminded of it? The doctrine of recollection suggested that all genuine learning was actually a form of self-discovery, a process of awakening to truths that the soul had always known, but had forgotten in its embodiment in the physical world. This gave philosophical education a quasi-religious character, transforming it from the mere transmission of information into a process of spiritual awakening and purification. But Plato's philosophy was not simply concerned with abstract theoretical questions. Throughout his dialogues, he grappled with practical questions about how to live well, how to face death, how to maintain friendship, how to create beauty. The Phaedo presents Socrates on the last day of his life, discussing the immortality of the soul with his friends and demonstrating through his own example how philosophical wisdom could provide courage and tranquility in the face of death. The symposium explores the nature of love, showing how erotic attraction to physical beauty could be transformed into love of spiritual beauty and ultimately into love of the form of beauty itself. These dialogues reveal Plato's conviction that philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a comprehensive way of life. The philosopher was someone who had reoriented their entire existence around the pursuit of wisdom and virtue, someone who had learned to see beyond the superficial attractions and fears that dominate most human lives to the eternal realities that alone deserved ultimate concern. This vision of philosophy as a transformative spiritual discipline would have enormous influence on subsequent thinkers, both within the classical tradition and in later religious and philosophical movements. The idea that there are truths accessible to reason that transcend the material world, that the human soul has an affinity with these eternal truths, that education should aim at the conversion of the entire person, rather than merely the transmission of information. These Platonic themes would be taken up and developed by Christian, Islamic, and Jewish thinkers throughout the medieval period, and would continue to influence Western thought well into the modern era. Yet, even as Plato was developing this comprehensive philosophical system, questions were being raised about its foundations and implications. The most searching and systematic of these criticisms would come from within his own school, from a student who had spent 20 years in Plato's academy, but who would ultimately develop a very different approach to philosophical problems. Aristotle arrived in Athens as a young man from the northern Greek kingdom of Macedonia. His father had been court physician to the Macedonian king, and this medical background may have contributed to Aristotle's lifelong interest in biological and empirical investigation. Unlike Plato, who had been drawn to philosophy primarily by ethical and political concerns, Aristotle seems to have been fascinated by the entire range of human knowledge: biology, physics, psychology, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, logic. He wanted to understand not just the eternal and unchanging, but the temporal and changing as well. Initially, Aristotle was deeply influenced by Platonic ideas. His early works, now lost, apparently defended versions of the theory of forms and other central Platonic doctrines. But gradually, as he matured as a thinker, he began to develop serious criticisms of his teacher's philosophy. The theory of forms, he argued, multiplied entities unnecessarily and failed to explain adequately how eternal forms could be related to temporal particulars. If the form of triangle exists in a separate realm, how can it help us understand the triangular things we encounter in the physical world? Moreover, Aristotle believed that Plato had neglected the study of the natural world in favor of abstract mathematical and metaphysical speculation. But the natural world, with all its complexity and diversity, was worthy of careful investigation in its own right. Instead of trying to explain away change and multiplicity as inferior copies of eternal unity, philosophy should try to understand how change and development actually work. What principles govern the growth of living things, how different kinds of substances interact with each other. This shift in focus led Aristotle to develop what would become one of the most comprehensive and systematic philosophical frameworks ever created. Unlike Plato's dialogues, which preserved something of the open-ended character of Socratic questioning, Aristotle's works read like textbooks, carefully organized treatises that methodically examined different aspects of reality and human experience. These works were probably originally lecture notes intended for use in Aristotle's own school, the Lyceum, which he founded after leaving Plato's academy. The scope of Aristotelian philosophy was breathtaking. His logical works established the principles of valid reasoning that would dominate Western logic for over 2,000 years. His physics and other scientific works attempted to explain the fundamental principles governing motion, change, and natural processes. His biological works, based on extensive empirical observation, classified and described hundreds of animal species. His ethics explored the nature of human virtue and the conditions for human flourishing. His politics examined different forms of government and their strengths and weaknesses. His poetics analyzed the nature of tragedy, comedy, and epic poetry. Yet, underlying this diversity was a unified philosophical vision, centered on Aristotle's conviction that reality consisted fundamentally of individual substances, particular things like this horse, that tree, this human being, rather than abstract universal forms. These substances were composites of matter and form, but the form was not a separate entity existing in another realm. Rather, it was the organizing principle that made each substance the kind of thing it was, and enabled it to function in characteristic ways. This approach allowed Aristotle to take seriously both the unity and the diversity of the natural world. Each individual substance was a genuine unity, not merely a pale copy of some more real universal. Yet substances could be classified into species and genera based on their shared forms, making scientific knowledge possible without requiring the postulation of a separate realm of abstract entities. Change, which had posed such difficulties for earlier philosophers, was explained by Aristotle as the actualization of potential. An acorn was potentially an oak tree. Under the right conditions, this potentiality could be actualized. Motion, was the process by which things moved from potentiality toward actuality, guided by their own internal nature as well as by external influences. This framework provided the foundation for Aristotle's influential account of causation. To understand anything fully, he argued, we need to understand 4 different types of causes: the material cause, what something is made of; the formal cause, what something is; the efficient cause, what causes something to happen; and the final cause, what something is for; formal cause, what kind of thing it is; the efficient cause, what brought it about; and the final cause, what purpose it serves. Modern science has largely abandoned formal and final causation in favor of efficient causation alone, but Aristotle believed that all 4 types were necessary for complete explanation, especially when dealing with living things and human actions. The emphasis on final causation, the idea that things act for purposes or ends, was central to Aristotle's approach to ethics and politics. Human beings, he argued, have a characteristic function or purpose, just as organs have functions within living bodies. To live well is to fulfill this function excellently, to actualize the potentialities that are distinctively human. But what is the distinctive function of human beings? Aristotle's answer was that humans are rational animals, beings capable of reasoning and choosing. Therefore, human flourishing, eudaimonia, often translated as happiness but meaning something more like well-being or the good life, consists in the excellent performance of rational activities. This includes both theoretical reasoning, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, and practical reasoning, the intelligent direction of action and emotion. The excellent performance of these rational activities constitutes virtue, but virtue for Aristotle was not simply a matter of following rules or maximizing pleasure. Rather, it was a matter of character, of becoming the kind of person who reliably chooses well in particular situations. Moral virtues like courage, generosity, and justice were character traits that enabled people to find the right balance between extremes. Courage, for example, was the mean between cowardice and recklessness. This emphasis on character rather than rules or consequences would make Aristotelian virtue ethics an enduring alternative to other approaches to moral philosophy. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" Aristotelian ethics asks, "What kind of person should I be?" The answer requires not just intellectual understanding but practical wisdom. Phronesis, the ability to perceive what particular situations demand and to act appropriately. But individual virtue was not enough for human flourishing. Human beings are by nature political animals, Aristotle argued, and they can achieve their full potential only within well-ordered communities. This led him to extensive investigations of different forms of government and their advantages and disadvantages. Unlike Plato, who had outlined a single ideal state, Aristotle recognized that different constitutional arrangements might be appropriate for different circumstances. The best constitution, he argued, was one that promoted the common good rather than the private interests of the rulers, and that distributed power in a way that reflected the virtue and contribution of citizens. In practice, this often meant some form of mixed constitution that combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, while avoiding the corruption that each of these forms was prone to when taken to extremes. Throughout all of these investigations, Aristotle maintained that philosophy should begin with careful attention to the phenomena, to what actually appears to be the case based on observation and common human experience. Unlike Plato, who was often willing to reject the evidence of the senses in favor of purely rational arguments, Aristotle insisted that any adequate theory must be able to account for and illuminate the complexity of actual experience. This empirical orientation would prove to be enormously influential in the development of later science and philosophy. Aristotelian natural philosophy dominated medieval and Renaissance thought, and even when it was eventually superseded by modern physics, the Aristotelian emphasis on careful observation and systematic classification continued to inform scientific method. Yet Aristotle also recognized that there were limits to what empirical investigation could achieve. At the highest level, philosophy dealt with questions about being as such, about the first principles and ultimate causes that could not themselves be observed, but that had to be postulated to make sense of what could be observed. This first philosophy, later called metaphysics, investigated the most general features of reality sought. What it means for something to exist, how unity and plurality are related, whether there are eternal substances, and what role divine causation might play in the natural order. These metaphysical investigations led Aristotle to postulate the existence of an eternal, unchanging substance, the unmoved mover, that served as the ultimate source of motion and change in the natural world. This divine principle was pure actuality, containing no potentiality, and its primary activity was thought thinking itself. It influenced the world not through direct intervention, but by being the object of desire and imitation for all other things, which sought to actualize their own potentials in response to the perfection they dimly perceived in the divine. This theological dimension of Aristotelian philosophy would prove to be particularly influential in medieval Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thought, where Aristotelian arguments for the existence and nature of God were integrated with religious revelation. But even in its purely philosophical form, Aristotle's metaphysics represented a remarkable synthesis of empirical investigation and rational argument, an attempt to understand the deepest principles of reality through careful attention to both particular phenomena and universal logical requirements. By the time of Aristotle's death in 322 BCE, Greek philosophy had achieved a level of sophistication and systematic development that would not be equaled for many centuries. The questions that the earliest thinkers had raised about the fundamental nature of reality had been refined and elaborated into comprehensive theories that addressed not just cosmological and metaphysical issues, but ethical, political, logical, and aesthetic ones as well. Yet this very success created new challenges. As philosophical systems became more complex and technical, they became less accessible to ordinary people seeking practical guidance for living. As different schools developed competing approaches to fundamental questions, it became less clear whether philosophy was actually making progress toward truth or simply multiplying conflicting opinions. As Greek culture came into contact with other civilizations through the conquests of Alexander the Great, who had been Aristotle's pupil, traditional Greek assumptions about virtue, knowledge, and the good life were challenged by alternative ways of understanding human existence. The response to these challenges would shape the next phase of ancient philosophy, as thinkers sought to develop approaches that could provide practical wisdom for individuals living in an increasingly complex and uncertain world. Philosophy would become less concerned with grand systematic theories and more focused on therapeutic techniques for achieving tranquility and happiness in the face of life's inevitable sufferings and disappointments. But even as philosophy evolved in these new directions, the achievements of the classical period, the Socratic commitment to rational examination, the Platonic vision of eternal truth accessible to human reason, the Aristotelian integration of empirical observation with systematic theory, would remain as permanent contributions to human intellectual culture. These thinkers had established philosophy not just as an academic discipline, but as a fundamental human activity, the attempt to understand ourselves and our world through the careful use of reason and evidence. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these ancient achievements, we can begin to appreciate how the questions these early philosophers raised continue to shape our own attempts to make sense of existence. The tension between appearance and reality, the relationship between individual and universal, the nature of knowledge and virtue, the proper ordering of human life. These remain live issues for anyone who takes seriously the Socratic injunction to examine their life and the Aristotelian conviction that human beings are by nature seekers of knowledge and understanding. The philosophical landscape that emerged after Aristotle was like a garden suddenly exposed to new winds and weather. The conquests of Alexander the Great had opened up the Mediterranean world in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Greek ideas traveled to India, Egypt, and Persia, while foreign concepts flowed back into the Greek heartland. The comfortable certainties of the classical city-state, where a citizen knew their place and their duties, began to dissolve in the face of vast cosmopolitan empires, where traditional boundaries between Greek and barbarian, citizen and foreigner, seemed increasingly arbitrary. Into this uncertain world came philosophers who were less interested in constructing grand theoretical systems than in providing practical guidance for individuals trying to navigate an increasingly complex social and cultural landscape. These thinkers shared a common concern. How can a person achieve happiness and tranquility in a world that seems chaotic, unpredictable, and often hostile to human flourishing? Their answers would give birth to philosophical movements that would dominate intellectual life for centuries, and continue to influence how we think about the art of living even today. The first of these movements emerged from the teachings of Epicurus, who established his famous garden in Athens around 307 BRE. The garden was not just a school, but a community, a place where men and women, slaves and free citizens, could come together to pursue philosophy as a way of life. This inclusive approach was itself revolutionary in a world where philosophical education had typically been restricted to free male citizens of good family. Epicurus taught that the goal of philosophy was not theoretical knowledge but practical wisdom, the ability to live well. And living well, he argued, meant achieving a state of tranquil pleasure, free from pain and anxiety. But this was not the crude hedonism that critics would later attribute to Epicureanism. Epicurus distinguished carefully between different types of pleasure, arguing that the highest pleasures were those that involved the absence of pain and disturbance, rather than positive sensations of gratification. The pleasure of eating when hungry was temporary and often followed by discomfort. The pleasure of friendship, by contrast, could be sustained indefinitely and brought with it no negative consequences. The pleasure of philosophical contemplation was even higher since it engaged the noblest part of human nature and could be pursued regardless of external circumstances. True pleasure, Epicurus taught, was not about getting more of what you want, but about learning to want what you already have. This required a careful analysis of human desires and fears. Most people, Epicurus observed, made themselves miserable by pursuing goals that were either impossible to achieve or not worth achieving. They craved immortality, but death was natural and inevitable. They sought fame and power, but these were largely beyond their control and often brought more anxiety than satisfaction. They feared the gods and worried about punishment in the afterlife, but these fears were based on superstition rather than rational understanding. The Epicurean approach to these problems was to apply reason systematically to expose their irrationality. Death, for example, was nothing to us because we could only experience harm while we were alive. When we are alive, death has not yet occurred. When death occurs, we no longer exist to experience it. Therefore, death itself could never harm us, and the fear of death was simply a confusion about the nature of personal existence. Similarly, the fear of divine punishment was based on anthropomorphic projections that attributed human emotions and concerns to the gods. If gods existed at all, Epicurus argued, they must be perfectly happy and therefore could not be motivated by anger, jealousy, or the desire for revenge. They would have no reason to interfere in human affairs, much less to punish mortals for their behavior. The gods, existing in a state of perfect bliss, would be models of the tranquil pleasure that humans should strive to achieve, rather than cosmic tyrants demanding worship and sacrifice. This rational analysis of common fears was combined with a sophisticated understanding of the natural world derived from the atomic theory of Democritus. Everything that existed, including human beings, was composed of tiny, indivisible particles moving in empty space according to natural laws. This materialistic worldview eliminated supernatural explanations for natural phenomena and provided a foundation for understanding human beings as part of the natural order, rather than as special creations with mysterious spiritual destinies. The atomic theory also supported Epicurean ethics by suggesting that death was simply the dissolution of the atomic compounds that temporarily constituted individual persons. Just as a house could be demolished and its materials used to build something else, the atoms that made up a human body would eventually separate and recombine into new forms. There was no soul that survived this dissolution, no consciousness that persisted after death, and therefore no basis for fears about posthumous punishment or rewards. This naturalistic approach extended to Epicurean political philosophy as well. Unlike Plato and Aristotle, who had sought to identify the ideal form of government or the natural basis of political authority, Epicurus advocated withdrawal from political life altogether. Politics, he argued, was inherently corrupting because it involved the pursuit of power and fame, goals that were both difficult to achieve and likely to produce anxiety even if achieved. The wise person would seek security and tranquility in private life, cultivating friendships and philosophical understanding, rather than trying to reform society or achieve public recognition. This might seem like a philosophy of selfish withdrawal, but Epicurus saw it differently. By achieving personal tranquility and modeling the philosophical life, individuals could create islands of peace and rationality in a chaotic world. The garden itself was an example of how people could organize their lives around genuine rather than artificial pleasures, creating communities based on mutual affection and shared commitment to wisdom rather than on competition for scarce resources. The Epicurean emphasis on friendship was particularly important in this regard. Unlike family relationships, which were given by nature, or political relationships, which were imposed by circumstances, friendship was freely chosen and could therefore be based on genuine affinity and mutual respect. Friends who had achieved philosophical wisdom could support each other in maintaining their commitment to rational living, providing encouragement during difficult times, and sharing in the simple pleasures that made life worth living. This vision of philosophy as therapeutic practice, aimed at achieving practical results in terms of human happiness and tranquility, represented a significant departure from the more theoretical approaches of earlier thinkers. Where Plato had sought eternal truths accessible to pure reason, and Aristotle had tried to construct comprehensive systems that would explain all aspects of reality, Epicurus focused on the immediate question of how to live well here and now. Yet Epicureanism faced serious challenges, both from critics who misunderstood its teachings and from the inherent difficulties of its own position. If pleasure was the highest good, how could one avoid sliding into crude hedonism? If withdrawal from politics was advisable, how could society maintain the institutions necessary for individual security and flourishing? If death was truly nothing to us, why did even committed Epicureans seem to struggle with mortality anxiety? These questions became even more pressing when Epicurean ideas encountered the very different philosophical traditions that were developing elsewhere in the Hellenistic world. In particular, the Stoic school, which emerged from the teachings of Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, offered radically different answers to the same fundamental question about how to achieve human happiness and tranquility. Where Epicurus had located the good life in the intelligent pursuit of pleasure, the Stoics argued that happiness consisted in living according to virtue, regardless of whether this produced pleasure or pain. Where Epicurus had counseled withdrawal from public life, the Stoics insisted that rational beings had duties to participate in the larger community of humanity. Where Epicurus had sought to eliminate anxiety by showing that most fears were irrational, the Stoics proposed to achieve tranquility by accepting whatever fate might bring with equanimity and grace. The founder of Stoicism, Zeno, had been influenced by the Cynic philosophers, particularly Diogenes of Sinope, who had taught that happiness required radical simplification of life and rejection of conventional social values. But where the Cynics had often expressed their philosophy through shocking behavior and deliberate violation of social norms, Zeno sought to develop a more systematic and socially acceptable approach to the same basic insights about the relationship between virtue and happiness. The early Stoics developed a comprehensive philosophical system that integrated logic, physics, and ethics into a unified worldview. Logic provided the tools for distinguishing true from false beliefs and valid from invalid arguments. Physics explained the rational structure of the cosmos and humanity's place within it. Ethics showed how individuals could align their lives with this cosmic rationality to achieve genuine flourishing. At the heart of Stoic physics was the doctrine that the universe was a single, living, rational organism, pervaded throughout by a divine principle called the Logos. This cosmic reason manifested itself as the natural laws that governed everything from the movements of the planets, to the growth of plants, to the development of rational beings like humans. Everything that happened was part of a vast causal network that unfolded according to rational principles, even when those principles were not immediately apparent to finite human understanding. This deterministic worldview might seem to eliminate human freedom and moral responsibility, but the Stoics argued that it actually provided the foundation for both. Human beings were free when their actions flowed from their own rational nature, rather than being compelled by external forces or internal passions. And they were morally responsible precisely because they had the capacity to understand and align themselves with the rational order of the cosmos. The key insight was that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can control how we respond to what happens to us. External events, whether they involve gain or loss, pleasure or pain, praise or blame, are neither good nor bad in themselves. They become good or bad only through our judgments about them and our emotional reactions to them. The wise person learns to maintain equanimity in the face of all external circumstances, finding happiness not in getting what they want, but in wanting what they get. This required a systematic program of mental training designed to root out false beliefs about what is truly good or bad, and to cultivate the emotional dispositions that flow from correct understanding. The Stoics developed elaborate exercises for examining one's judgments, challenging automatic emotional responses, and practicing the philosophical principles that could lead to wisdom and tranquility. One of the most important of these exercises was the discipline of desire, learning to want only what is entirely up to us and to be indifferent to everything else. This meant focusing attention on our own choices, decisions, and responses, rather than on outcomes that depend partly on factors beyond our control. The Stoic archer aims carefully and releases the arrow with proper technique, but does not become emotionally attached to whether the arrow hits its target, since wind and other external factors might intervene. Another crucial practice was the discipline of action, learning to act for the common good rather than purely personal benefit. Since all rational beings participate in the same cosmic logos, we have natural duties to care for one another and to contribute to the welfare of the larger community. This might involve political participation, unlike the Epicurean counsel of withdrawal, but it should be undertaken from a sense of duty rather than from ambition or the desire for personal gain. The discipline of assent involved careful attention to the beliefs and judgments that we accept as true. Most human suffering, the Stoics argued, came not from external events themselves, but from false beliefs about the significance of those events. By learning to examine our thoughts critically and to withhold assent from judgments that go beyond what we can actually know, we can avoid the emotional turmoil that results from attachment to things beyond our control. These practical exercises were supported by a sophisticated theoretical framework that drew on the best insights of earlier philosophers, while adapting them to the needs of individuals living in the cosmopolitan world of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Stoic sage represented an ideal of human perfection, someone who had achieved complete wisdom and virtue, and therefore complete happiness and tranquility. Few, if any, actual peoples ever achieved this ideal, but it provided a goal toward which everyone could strive and a standard by which progress could be measured. The appeal of Stoicism lay partly in its practical orientation and partly in its cosmic vision. Here was a philosophy that offered concrete techniques for dealing with the inevitable difficulties of human life, while also providing a sense of meaning and purpose grounded in the rational structure of the universe itself. The Stoic practitioner was not withdrawing from the world, but learning to engage with it more wisely, contributing to human welfare, while maintaining inner freedom from the anxieties and attachments that normally make such engagement painful. But Stoicism, too, faced serious challenges, both from external critics and from internal tensions within the system itself. If everything happens according to fate, how can human choices be genuinely free? If virtue is the only true good, why do even committed Stoics seem to prefer health to sickness, prosperity to poverty? If the cosmic logos is perfectly rational, why does the world contain so much apparent irrationality and suffering? These questions became particularly acute when Stoic philosophy encountered the skeptical challenges that were being developed in other philosophical schools of the Hellenistic period. The academic skeptics, followers of Plato's Academy who had moved away from Plato's own positive doctrines, argued that human reason was simply too limited and fallible to achieve the kind of certain knowledge that both Epicureans and Stoics claimed to possess. Arcesilaus and later Carneades developed sophisticated arguments designed to show that for every philosophical position, equally strong arguments could be developed for the opposite position. If this was true, then the rational thing to do was to suspend judgment entirely rather than committing oneself to any particular theory about the nature of reality or the good life. This skeptical challenge was not merely academic, but had practical implications. If we cannot know what is truly good or bad, how should we live? The skeptical answer was that we should follow probability and common sense rather than philosophical theory, doing what seems reasonable in particular circumstances, without claiming to have discovered universal truths about human nature or cosmic purpose. The Pyrrhonian skeptics, following the example of Pyrrho of Elis, pushed this approach even further. They argued that the goal of philosophy should be ataraxia, undisturbedness, or tranquility, achieved not through positive knowledge but through the suspension of judgment about all theoretical questions. When we stop trying to determine what is ultimately true or false, good or bad, we free ourselves from the anxiety that comes from defending particular positions against criticism. This skeptical approach had its own therapeutic value, offering relief from the intellectual pride and dogmatic attachment that seemed to characterize the competing philosophical schools. But it also raised troubling questions about the very possibility of philosophical wisdom. If all theories were equally questionable, what was the point of philosophical inquiry? If suspension of judgment was the goal, why engage in argument at all? These debates between Epicureans, Stoics, and skeptics dominated philosophical discussion for several centuries, creating a rich intellectual environment in which different approaches to the fundamental questions of human existence could be tested against one another. Each school developed increasingly sophisticated responses to the criticisms of its rivals, leading to refinements and developments that would influence later thinkers throughout the ancient world and beyond. The practical orientation of Hellenistic philosophy also meant that these ideas spread far beyond the narrow circles of professional philosophers. Stoic principles influenced Roman statesmen and military leaders. Epicurean insights shaped the poetry of Lucretius and the lifestyle-matism in religion and politics. Choices of educated Romans. Skeptical arguments provided intellectual tools for critics of dogma. As these Greek philosophical movements encountered Roman culture and eventually Christian theology, they would undergo further transformations that would carry their insights into new contexts and applications. The therapeutic conception of philosophy, the focus on practical wisdom rather than purely theoretical knowledge, the recognition that different approaches might be appropriate for different temperaments and circumstances, these Hellenistic innovations would remain influential long after the specific schools that originated them had disappeared. But even as philosophy became more practical and accessible, it maintained its connection to the fundamental questions that had motivated the earliest Greek thinkers. What is the nature of reality? How can human beings achieve genuine happiness? What is our place in the larger cosmic order? The Hellenistic philosophers had shown that these questions could not be answered through abstract speculation alone, but required careful attention to the actual conditions of human life and the practical requirements of living well in an uncertain and often difficult world. The synthesis of theoretical insight with practical wisdom that characterized the best Hellenistic philosophy would remain an ideal for later thinkers, even as the specific answers proposed by Epicureans, Stoics, and skeptics were modified or rejected. The recognition that philosophy should be not just an academic discipline but a way of life, not just a collection of interesting theories but a set of practices for achieving human flourishing, had become a permanent part of the philosophical tradition. As the Roman Empire gradually absorbed the Greek world, these philosophical movements would find new expressions in Latin literature and Roman institutions. Stoicism would influence emperors and slaves alike, providing a framework for understanding duty, honor, and the proper response to both good and bad fortune. Epicurean insights would shape poetry and private life, offering alternatives to the competitive values that dominated Roman public culture. Skeptical arguments would provide intellectual tools for religious and political criticism, keeping alive the spirit of rational inquiry, even in contexts that might otherwise discourage questioning of established authorities. The transformation of Greek philosophy in the Roman world would create new syntheses and new applications, showing how philosophical insights could be adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining their essential insights about the nature of wisdom and the requirements of human flourishing. As we continue to explore this rich tradition, we can begin to see how the ancient quest for understanding ourselves and our place in the cosmos continues to illuminate contemporary questions about meaning, value, and the good life. The philosophical movements that emerged from this fertile period of intellectual creativity had shown that the love of wisdom could take many different forms, from the systematic construction of comprehensive theories to the practical cultivation of specific virtues and mental habits. They had demonstrated that philosophy could be both rigorous in its reasoning and relevant to the actual concerns of human beings trying to live well in challenging circumstances. As the Roman world embraced these diverse philosophical currents, something remarkable began to happen. Philosophy was no longer confined to the academies of Athens or the gardens of Epicurus. It was becoming woven into the very fabric of daily life, carried by merchants along trade routes, discussed in the baths and forums of provincial cities, practiced in the private chambers of emperors and the humble quarters of slaves alike. The Romans, with their practical temperament and their genius for adaptation, proved to be ideal inheritors of Greek philosophical wisdom. They took these abstract ideas and made them concrete, these theoretical insights, and made them applicable to the real challenges of governance, military command, family life, and personal conduct. In doing so, they created something new, while preserving something ancient, a living tradition of philosophical reflection that could speak to human beings regardless of their station in life or their particular circumstances. Consider the figure of Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great Roman orator and statesman who lived during the tumultuous final decades of the Roman Republic. Cicero was not primarily a philosopher in the sense of developing original theoretical insights, but he was something perhaps more important, a masterful translator and popularizer who made Greek philosophical wisdom accessible to Roman audiences. His letters, speeches, and philosophical treatises show us how a thoughtful person might draw upon different philosophical traditions to navigate the complexities of political life, personal relationships, and moral decision-making. When Cicero faced exile from Rome due to political conflicts, he turned to Stoic principles about the things we can and cannot control. When he grieved the death of his beloved daughter Tullia, he explored Platonic ideas about the immortality of the soul. When he sought to understand his duties as a citizen and public servant, he drew upon Aristotelian insights about virtue and the common good. He was not interested in philosophical purity or systematic consistency, but in practical wisdom that could help him and his contemporaries live better lives. This eclectic approach would become characteristic of Roman philosophy more generally. Rather than adhering rigidly to a single school of thought, educated Romans tended to select ideas and practices from different traditions based on their usefulness for particular purposes. They might be Stoic in their approach to public duty, Epicurean in their appreciation of friendship and simple pleasures, and Platonic in their understanding of transcendent ideals that gave meaning to human striving. This philosophical pragmatism was perfectly suited to the Roman genius for synthesis and adaptation. Just as Rome had created a legal system that could govern diverse peoples across vast territories, and an administrative structure that could maintain order from Britain to Egypt, so Roman thinkers created philosophical approaches that could serve the needs of different individuals in different circumstances, while maintaining connection to the deeper insights that had emerged from centuries of Greek reflection. Perhaps no figure better exemplifies this Roman approach to philosophy than the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose private reflections have come down to us as the Meditations. Here we see Stoic principles not as abstract theoretical propositions, but as living practices worked out in the daily life of someone bearing enormous responsibilities in challenging circumstances. Marcus Aurelius was not writing for publication but for himself, trying to maintain his philosophical equilibrium while dealing with military campaigns, political crises, family tragedies, and the burdens of absolute power. The tone of the Meditations is deeply personal, yet universally relevant. Marcus reminds himself to focus on what is within his control, to accept what cannot be changed, to treat others with justice and compassion, to remember the transitory nature of all external circumstances. These are not novel philosophical insights, but ancient wisdom applied to immediate practical challenges. What makes them powerful is precisely their lack of theoretical pretension, their direct engagement with the actual difficulties of human existence. You have power over your mind, not outside events, Marcus writes to himself. Realize this, and you will find strength. This simple observation, rooted in Stoic principles developed centuries earlier, becomes a practical tool for maintaining sanity and effectiveness in the face of circumstances that might otherwise prove overwhelming. The emperor who controlled vast armies and governed millions of people recognized that the most important battle was the one fought within his own consciousness, the struggle to maintain rational perspective and moral integrity regardless of external pressures. This internalization of philosophical wisdom was not unique to Marcus Aurelius, but reflected a broader transformation in how philosophy was understood and practiced in the Roman world. Philosophy was becoming less about constructing elaborate theoretical systems and more about developing practical techniques for living well. It was becoming psychological and spiritual rather than purely intellectual, concerned with the formation of character and the cultivation of wisdom, rather than simply the analysis of logical arguments or metaphysical principles. This shift was evident in the work of other Roman Stoic writers as well. Seneca, the wealthy advisor to Emperor Nero, wrote letters to his friend Lucilius that read like a correspondence course in practical philosophy. Each letter takes up a particular theme: how to deal with anger, how to face death, how to use time wisely, how to maintain friendship, and explores it through a combination of general principles and specific examples drawn from daily experience. Seneca's approach is notably undogmatic and experimental. He presents Stoic ideas not as rigid doctrines that must be accepted without question, but as hypotheses to be tested through practical application. He acknowledges his own failures to live up to philosophical ideals, while maintaining that the pursuit of wisdom is worthwhile even if perfection remains elusive. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, he observes, recognizing that philosophical development is an ongoing process rather than a destination to be reached once and for all. The same practical orientation can be seen in the teachings of Epictetus, a former slave who became one of the most influential Stoic teachers of the imperial period. Epictetus focused relentlessly on the fundamental Stoic distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us, showing his students how to apply this principle to every aspect of their lives. His teachings, recorded by his student Arrian, read like transcripts of actual classroom discussions, full of concrete examples, analogies drawn from everyday experience, and direct challenges to common assumptions about what makes life worth living. Wealth consists not in having great possessions, Epictetus taught, but in having few wants. This was not mere theoretical speculation about the nature of happiness, but practical guidance based on his own experience of slavery and freedom, poverty and modest prosperity. Having been literally owned by another human being, Epictetus understood in the most concrete terms what it meant to distinguish between external circumstances and inner freedom. His teachings carried the authority of lived experience rather than abstract reasoning. This emphasis on practical application and personal transformation was reinforced by the social and political conditions of the early Roman Empire. The republican institutions that had provided earlier generations with opportunities for meaningful political participation had given way to imperial autocracy. Traditional Roman values of public service and civic virtue had to be redefined in a context where real political power was concentrated in the hands of the emperor and his immediate circle. For most educated Romans, this meant that philosophy became primarily a matter of private rather than public concern. Instead of asking how to serve the state or reform political institutions, thoughtful individuals focused on questions of personal development and the cultivation of inner resources that could sustain them regardless of external circumstances. Philosophy became therapeutic in the deepest sense, not just offering intellectual consolation, but providing practical techniques for achieving psychological and spiritual health. This therapeutic conception of philosophy was particularly evident in the emergence of what we might call philosophical medicine, the systematic use of philosophical principles and practices to address psychological suffering and promote mental well-being. Just as physicians had developed techniques for diagnosing and treating physical ailments, philosophical practitioners began developing methods for identifying and addressing the false beliefs, unhealthy emotions, and destructive habits that prevented people from achieving genuine happiness and tranquility. The Stoics were particularly innovative in this regard, developing detailed analyses of the cognitive roots of emotional disturbance and practical exercises for cultivating emotional resilience. They recognized that most psychological suffering was not caused by external events themselves, but by our judgments and interpretations of those events. By learning to examine and modify these judgments, individuals could free themselves from much unnecessary pain while becoming more effective in dealing with genuine challenges. This approach required careful attention to the specific ways that false beliefs manifested in particular individuals. Some people might be prone to anger, others to anxiety, still others to excessive attachment to material possessions or social status. Each required a somewhat different therapeutic approach tailored to their particular temperament and circumstances. Philosophy was becoming personalized, recognizing that universal principles needed to be applied differently for different individuals. The influence of this therapeutic approach extended far beyond professional philosophers to shape broader cultural attitudes toward education, character development, and the goals of human life. Roman literature of this period is filled with reflections on how to live well, how to face adversity, how to maintain integrity in challenging circumstances. From the poetry of Horace to the histories of Tacitus, we see thoughtful individuals grappling with philosophical questions, not as abstract intellectual exercises, but as urgent practical concerns. This cultural transformation was facilitated by the remarkable diversity of the Roman world itself. The empire brought together people from dozens of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, each contributing their own insights and practices to the common pool of human wisdom. Greek philosophical ideas encountered Egyptian mystical traditions, Persian religious concepts, Celtic spiritual practices, and Germanic warrior values. Out of this mixing emerged new synthetic approaches that combined insights from multiple traditions while remaining grounded in the practical concerns of daily life. The mystery religions that became increasingly popular during this period reflected this synthetic tendency. Cults devoted to Mithras, Isis, Cybele, and other deities offered their adherents not just ritual observances, but comprehensive approaches to living that combined religious devotion with philosophical reflection and practical moral guidance. These traditions recognized that human beings needed not just intellectual understanding, but emotional and spiritual transformation, practices that could engage the whole person rather than merely the rational faculty. This holistic approach to human development would prove to be one of the most enduring contributions of the Roman period to the philosophical tradition. The recognition that genuine wisdom required not just correct theoretical understanding, but the cultivation of appropriate emotional dispositions, social skills, and spiritual practices would influence later thinkers throughout the medieval and modern periods. Philosophy was learning to address the full complexity of human nature rather than focusing exclusively on rational argument and logical analysis. At the same time, this practical orientation did not mean abandoning intellectual rigor or theoretical sophistication. Roman thinkers made significant contributions to logic, mathematics, natural philosophy, and metaphysical speculation. But these theoretical investigations were typically motivated by practical concerns and evaluated in terms of their usefulness for promoting human flourishing, rather than pursued as ends in themselves. The great Roman architectural and engineering achievements of this period reflected a similar synthesis of theoretical knowledge with practical application. The Pantheon in Rome, with its magnificent concrete dome, represented centuries of accumulated understanding about materials, structural principles, and construction techniques, but it was built not as a demonstration of theoretical knowledge, but as a functional space for religious worship. The Roman road system drew upon sophisticated understanding of surveying, engineering, and logistics, but its purpose was to facilitate communication, trade, and military movement across the empire. This integration of theory and practice would become a hallmark of Roman contributions to human civilization more generally. In law, Roman jurists developed sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding justice, rights, and social obligations, but always with the practical goal of creating workable systems for resolving disputes and maintaining social order. In administration, Roman officials developed complex bureaucratic procedures and management techniques, but always with the aim of governing diverse populations effectively rather than for their own sake. The philosophical implications of this Roman approach were profound. It suggested that the ultimate test of any idea or theory was not its logical elegance or systematic completeness, but its capacity to contribute to human welfare and social harmony. Truth was not something to be contemplated in isolation, but something to be lived and applied. Knowledge was valuable not for its own sake, but for its power to transform individuals and communities in beneficial directions. This pragmatic orientation would prove to be remarkably influential in the development of later philosophical traditions. The Roman emphasis on practical wisdom, on the integration of theory and practice, on the importance of character development and social responsibility, would be taken up by Christian thinkers, Islamic philosophers, medieval scholastics, Renaissance humanists, and modern pragmatists. The idea that philosophy should serve human flourishing rather than existing as a purely academic discipline has Roman roots. But perhaps the most important Roman contribution to the philosophical tradition was the demonstration that wisdom could be cultivated and practiced by ordinary people living ordinary lives. You didn't need to withdraw from the world like Epicurus or achieve the theoretical perfection of the Stoic sage to benefit from philosophical insight. A merchant could apply Stoic principles to deal with business setbacks. A parent could draw upon Aristotelian ideas about virtue to guide their children's education. A soldier could use Platonic insights about courage and justice to maintain morale and effectiveness in difficult circumstances. This democratization of philosophy, this recognition that wisdom was not the exclusive possession of professional intellectuals, but was accessible to anyone willing to think carefully about their life and commitments, would prove to be one of the most liberating developments in human intellectual history. It established the principle that every individual had not just the capacity, but the responsibility to examine their beliefs, evaluate their goals, and strive for greater understanding and virtue. As the Roman world gradually gave way to new cultural and political arrangements, this practical philosophical tradition would continue to evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. Christian thinkers would integrate Roman insights about virtue and character development with biblical teachings about divine grace and redemption. Islamic philosophers would combine Aristotelian logic with Stoic ethics and Platonic metaphysics to create new syntheses appropriate to their cultural context. Medieval scholastics would use Roman legal concepts and administrative procedures as models for systematic theology and church governance. But throughout all these transformations, the fundamental insight that philosophy should serve human life rather than existing as an abstract intellectual exercise would remain constant. The Roman demonstration that wisdom could be practical without being superficial, accessible without being simplistic, would continue to inspire thinkers seeking to make philosophical insight relevant to the actual challenges and opportunities of human existence. The legacy of this period extends far beyond the specific ideas and practices that emerge from Roman philosophical reflection. It established a model for how thoughtful individuals might approach the perennial questions of human existence, not as puzzles to be solved once and for all through clever arguments, but as ongoing challenges requiring continuous attention, experimentation, and refinement. It showed that the pursuit of wisdom was not a luxury available only to those with leisure and resources, but a necessity for anyone seeking to live a fully human life. As we reflect on these ancient achievements from our contemporary vantage point, we can recognize both continuities and discontinuities between their concerns and our own. Like the Romans, we live in a diverse, cosmopolitan world, where traditional sources of meaning and authority have been challenged by cultural contact and intellectual criticism. Like them, we face the challenge of maintaining personal integrity and social cohesion in circumstances that often seem to reward cynicism and self-interest over virtue and commitment to the common good. The therapeutic conception of philosophy that emerged during this period speaks directly to contemporary concerns about mental health, personal development, and the search for meaning in a complex and often overwhelming world. The Roman recognition that philosophical insight needed to be translated into practical techniques and daily practices anticipates modern approaches to counseling, coaching, and self-improvement that emphasize behavioral change rather than purely theoretical understanding. At the same time, the Roman synthesis of different philosophical traditions offers a model for how we might approach the bewildering diversity of contemporary approaches to wisdom and human development. Instead of assuming that we must choose between competing systems or surrender to relativistic confusion, we might follow the Roman example of selecting insights and practices from different sources based on their practical value while maintaining critical evaluation and openness to revision. The Roman philosophers showed that it was possible to take ideas seriously without taking them too seriously, to commit ourselves to principles and practices without becoming rigid or dogmatic, to pursue wisdom while acknowledging the limitations of human understanding. These remain valuable lessons for anyone seeking to navigate the complexities of contemporary intellectual and spiritual life. Perhaps most importantly, the Roman period demonstrated that philosophy at its best was not an escape from the world, but a deeper engagement with it. The Stoic emperor who applied philosophical principles to governance, the former slave who used his understanding of freedom to teach others, the wealthy advisor who sought to integrate his material success with his commitment to virtue. These figures show us that wisdom and practical effectiveness, contemplation and action, personal development and social responsibility need not be in tension with each other. The ancient quest for understanding ourselves and our place in the cosmos had evolved by this point into something both more modest and more ambitious than its earliest expressions. More modest because it no longer claimed to provide final answers to ultimate questions, more ambitious because it sought to transform not just how people thought but how they lived. Philosophy had become a way of life in the fullest sense, offering not just intellectual satisfaction but practical guidance for achieving human flourishing in all its dimensions. This transformation would set the stage for the next great chapter in the development of philosophical thought, as the insights and practices that had emerged from centuries of Greek and Roman reflection encountered the revolutionary claims of a new religious movement that would reshape the intellectual landscape of the Western world. But that encounter would build upon foundations that had been carefully laid over many generations of thoughtful inquiry into the deepest questions of human existence. The philosophical tradition that emerged from this long process of development had shown that the love of wisdom could take many forms while maintaining its essential commitment to rational inquiry and practical application. It had demonstrated that different approaches to fundamental questions could be complementary rather than contradictory. That diversity of method and perspective could enrich rather than undermine the search for truth and understanding. Most importantly, it had established the principle that philosophical reflection was not a specialized activity for a few exceptional individuals, but a fundamental human capacity that could be cultivated by anyone willing to examine their life with honesty and courage. The Socratic injunction to know oneself had evolved into a comprehensive program for human development that addressed not just intellectual understanding, but emotional maturity, social responsibility, and spiritual growth. As the classical world gave way to new forms of civilization, these insights would not be lost but transformed, carried forward by new generations of thinkers who would adapt ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges while preserving its essential spirit. The questions that had motivated the earliest philosophers about the nature of reality, the requirements of the good life, the relationship between individual and community, would continue to demand attention from anyone seeking to live thoughtfully and responsibly in whatever circumstances they found themselves. The story of philosophy's beginnings had shown that the human capacity for wonder, questioning, and rational reflection was both remarkably durable and infinitely adaptable. No matter how much the external world might change, these fundamental aspects of human nature would continue to generate new insights and new applications of ancient wisdom. The love of wisdom that had first stirred in the Greek colonies of Asia Minor had become a permanent part of human culture, available to anyone willing to undertake the demanding but rewarding journey of philosophical inquiry. As these philosophical currents continued to flow and merge throughout the ancient world, something even more transformative was beginning to stir. The foundations that had been so carefully laid by generations of thinkers were about to encounter ideas that would challenge, reshape, and ultimately redirect the entire course of Western intellectual history. But this encounter would not be a simple replacement of old with new. Instead, it would create one of the most fascinating and complex syntheses in human thought, one that would dominate intellectual life for over 1,000 years and continue to influence how we think about fundamental questions even today. The emergence of Christianity in the first century of the Common Era represented far more than just another religious movement competing for adherents in the diverse spiritual marketplace of the Roman Empire. It brought with it claims about the nature of reality, the meaning of human existence, and the ultimate destiny of the cosmos that were both radically new and strangely familiar. New because they centered on the unprecedented assertion that the eternal divine had entered human history in a specific person at a particular time and place. Familiar because they addressed the same fundamental questions that had occupied philosophers for centuries. What is the nature of ultimate reality? How should human beings live? What is our relationship to the transcendent dimension of existence? The early Christian communities found themselves in a complex relationship with the philosophical traditions of their time. On one hand, many of the educated converts to Christianity had been trained in Greek philosophy and continued to find value in its insights and methods. They recognized that philosophical reasoning could be useful for defending Christian beliefs against critics, for clarifying theological concepts, and for exploring the implications of their faith for daily life. On the other hand, the Christian message seemed to challenge some of the fundamental assumptions of classical philosophy, particularly its confidence in human reason as the primary means of discovering truth about ultimate reality. This tension created both opportunities and challenges for the development of Christian thought. The opportunities lay in the possibility of using the sophisticated conceptual tools that philosophers had developed over the centuries to articulate and defend Christian beliefs in ways that could appeal to educated audiences. The challenges lay in determining how far philosophical concepts could be trusted when they seemed to conflict with revealed truth, and in developing new ways of thinking about questions that classical philosophy had approached very differently. The first major figure to grapple seriously with these issues was Justin Martyr, a 2nd century thinker who had studied various philosophical schools before converting to Christianity. Justin argued that there was a fundamental harmony between the best insights of Greek philosophy and Christian revelation, because both were expressions of the same divine logos that had appeared fully in Christ. The philosophers, he suggested, had been like people walking in partial darkness with the aid of a dim lamp, able to see some truths but missing others. Christianity was like the rising of the sun, illuminating clearly what had previously been glimpsed only dimly. This approach allowed Justin and other early Christian apologists to present their faith not as a rejection of philosophical wisdom, but as its fulfillment. Plato's insights about eternal truths accessible to human reason were confirmed and completed by Christian revelation. Aristotelian ethics were purified and perfected by Christian teachings about love and forgiveness. Stoic principles about living according to nature were transformed by the recognition that human nature had been created in the image of God and was destined for eternal communion with the divine. But this harmonizing approach also raised difficult questions. If philosophy and Christianity were fundamentally compatible, why did some philosophical conclusions seem to contradict Christian doctrines? How could finite human reason, operating without the aid of divine revelation, arrive at truths about infinite divine reality? And what happened to the philosophical commitment to following arguments wherever they might lead, when those arguments seemed to challenge beliefs that Christians held on the basis of faith rather than demonstration? These questions became even more pressing as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and began to attract intellectuals who were sophisticated in their understanding of classical philosophical traditions. Figures like Clement of Alexandria and his student Origen developed increasingly complex theological systems that drew heavily on Platonic and Stoic concepts while attempting to remain faithful to biblical revelation. They argued that philosophical reasoning was not just useful, but necessary for understanding the full implications of Christian faith, that God had given human beings rational faculties precisely so that they could explore the mysteries of divine truth. Origen in particular developed a comprehensive Christian philosophy that addressed questions about the nature of God, the creation of the world, the origin and destiny of human souls, and the meaning of salvation in ways that drew extensively on Platonic metaphysics, while claiming to be based on scriptural authority. His system was remarkably ambitious in its scope and sophisticated in its argumentation, representing perhaps the first fully developed attempt to create a systematic Christian theology using the conceptual tools of classical philosophy. But Origen's work also revealed some of the tensions inherent in this enterprise. His commitment to Platonic ideas about the pre-existence of souls and the eventual salvation of all rational beings led him to conclusions that many other Christians found incompatible with biblical teaching. His confidence in the power of human reason to penetrate divine mysteries seemed to some critics to undermine the necessity of faith and the authority of revealed truth. These controversies would continue to influence Christian thought for centuries, raising fundamental questions about the relationship between reason and revelation, philosophy and theology, human wisdom, and divine truth. The most systematic and influential resolution of these tensions would eventually be provided by Augustine of Hippo, whose intellectual journey from classical philosophy through various spiritual searches to Christian faith and theological reflection represents one of the most remarkable personal and intellectual odysseys in human history. Augustine had been trained in the rhetorical and philosophical traditions of his time, and he brought to his Christian reflection a sophisticated understanding of Platonic metaphysics, Aristotelian logic, and Stoic ethics. But Augustine's approach to the relationship between philosophy and Christianity was more complex and nuanced than that of earlier thinkers. He recognized both the value and the limitations of philosophical reasoning, arguing that while human reason could discover important truths about the natural world and human nature, it was fundamentally inadequate for understanding the deepest mysteries of divine reality and human salvation. Philosophy could prepare the mind for faith, but it could not substitute for the transforming encounter with divine grace that lay at the heart of Christian experience. This led Augustine to develop what would become one of the most influential approaches to the integration of faith and reason in Christian thought. Philosophy, he argued, could serve as a handmaiden to theology, providing useful conceptual tools and methods of analysis while remaining subordinate to the higher authority of revealed truth. Philosophical arguments could help defend Christian beliefs against critics and clarify theological concepts for believers, but they could never serve as the ultimate foundation for Christian faith. At the same time, Augustine insisted that faith itself was not blind or irrational, but involved a form of understanding that was deeper and more certain than anything that could be achieved through purely philosophical reasoning. The motto he coined, "Faith Seeking Understanding," captured this dynamic relationship between religious commitment and intellectual inquiry. Faith provided the foundation and direction for understanding, while understanding helped to deepen and clarify faith. This Augustinian synthesis would dominate Christian intellectual life for centuries, providing a framework within which philosophical reasoning could be pursued while maintaining clear boundaries between what could be known through human effort and what required divine revelation. It allowed Christian thinkers to engage seriously with classical philosophical traditions while maintaining their distinctive theological commitments. But Augustine's influence extended far beyond questions about the relationship between philosophy and theology. His psychological investigations, particularly his analysis of memory, time, and the structure of human consciousness, made significant contributions to philosophical understanding in their own right. His political theory, developed in response to the crisis of the Roman Empire, offered new ways of thinking about the relationship between earthly and heavenly cities, between temporal political arrangements and eternal spiritual realities. Perhaps most importantly, Augustine's personal reflections on his own spiritual and intellectual development, recorded in his Confessions, provided a new model for philosophical inquiry that emphasized the importance of subjective experience and inner transformation. Where classical philosophy had typically focused on objective analysis of external reality, Augustine showed how careful attention to the movements of one's own consciousness could reveal truths about human nature and divine reality that were not accessible through purely theoretical investigation. This turn toward interiority would prove to be enormously influential in the development of later philosophical and religious thought. Augustine's recognition that self-knowledge required not just intellectual analysis, but spiritual conversion, that understanding the truth about reality involved transformation of the knower as well as knowledge of the object, would inspire countless later thinkers from medieval mystics to modern existentialists. The synthesis that Augustine achieved between classical philosophical wisdom and Christian revelation provided a stable foundation for intellectual development throughout the medieval period. But it also set the stage for new questions and challenges as Christian civilization encountered other intellectual traditions and faced new historical circumstances. The expansion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries brought Christian thinkers into contact with sophisticated philosophical and scientific traditions that had been developing independently in the Islamic world. Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes had been working to integrate Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic theology in ways that were more systematic and comprehensive than anything that had been achieved in the Christian world. Their works, translated into Latin, would provide Christian thinkers with new philosophical resources, while also challenging them to develop more rigorous and systematic approaches to theological questions. At the same time, the recovery of additional Aristotelian texts that had been lost to the Latin West for centuries provided Christian scholars with access to more complete and sophisticated philosophical systems than had previously been available. The discovery of Aristotle's complete logical, physical, and metaphysical works through translations from Arabic and Greek sources revolutionized medieval intellectual life and forced Christian thinkers to grapple with philosophical challenges that earlier generations had not faced. This encounter between Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy would generate some of the most creative and influential intellectual work of the medieval period, culminating in the great systematic syntheses of figures like Thomas Aquinas. But it would also create new tensions and controversies as Christians debated how far Aristotelian concepts could be trusted, whether philosophical reasoning could lead to conclusions that contradicted Christian faith, and what the proper relationship should be between the authority of ancient philosophical texts and the authority of Christian revelation. These debates were not merely academic, but had practical implications for education, church governance, and the broader cultural life of medieval civilization. The emergence of universities as centers of learning brought together students and teachers from across Europe to engage in sophisticated philosophical and theological discussions that would shape intellectual development for centuries. The development of scholastic method, with its emphasis on systematic argumentation and the careful examination of conflicting authorities, provided new tools for intellectual inquiry while maintaining commitment to fundamental Christian beliefs. But perhaps the most important contribution of this medieval synthesis was its demonstration that philosophical reasoning and religious faith could be mutually enriching rather than necessarily competitive. The great scholastic thinkers showed that careful philosophical analysis could deepen understanding of theological mysteries, while theological insights could provide new perspectives on philosophical problems. They developed sophisticated accounts of the relationship between reason and revelation that allowed for genuine intellectual inquiry while maintaining clear commitments about the ultimate source and goal of human knowledge. This medieval achievement represented the culmination of a process that had begun with the earliest Greek philosophers and had been developing through various transformations for over a millennium. The love of wisdom that had first stirred in ancient Miletus had evolved into comprehensive systems of thought that addressed every aspect of human experience and cosmic reality. Philosophy had learned to integrate theoretical understanding with practical guidance, rational argument with spiritual insight, systematic analysis with transformative practice. But even as this medieval synthesis was reaching its mature form, new challenges were emerging that would eventually lead to further transformations in the philosophical tradition. The recovery of additional classical texts, the development of new scientific methods, the exploration of distant lands and cultures, the rise of new forms of political and economic organization, all of these factors would contribute to intellectual changes that would reshape how human beings understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. The story of philosophy's beginnings had shown that the human capacity for wonder, questioning, and systematic reflection was remarkably adaptable and resilient. Each generation of thinkers had found ways to build upon the insights of their predecessors while addressing the particular challenges and opportunities of their own historical moment. The questions that had first motivated philosophical inquiry about the nature of reality, the requirements of the good life, the relationship between individual and community, remained as urgent and compelling as ever, but the methods for addressing them and the conclusions that emerged continued to evolve and develop. As we trace this long development from the earliest Greek philosophers through the Roman synthesis to the medieval integration of philosophical and theological wisdom, we can see both continuities and transformations that reveal something fundamental about the nature of human intellectual life. The pursuit of understanding appears to be both a universal human capacity and a historically conditioned activity that takes different forms in different cultural contexts while maintaining its essential commitment to rational inquiry and practical application. The therapeutic conception of philosophy that had emerged in the Hellenistic period continued to influence medieval thinkers, but it was now integrated with a more comprehensive understanding of human nature and destiny that included both temporal and eternal dimensions. The practical orientation that had characterized Roman philosophy was preserved, but it was now grounded in a more systematic theoretical framework that could address ultimate questions about the meaning and purpose of existence. Most importantly, the medieval synthesis had shown that philosophical inquiry could be pursued with complete intellectual rigor, while maintaining commitment to transcendent truths that could not be fully comprehended through human reason alone. This recognition of the limitations of philosophical understanding paradoxically had liberated rather than constrained intellectual inquiry by freeing thinkers from the impossible burden of having to explain everything through purely rational means. The philosophical tradition that emerged from this long process of development had achieved a remarkable integration of different approaches to fundamental questions while maintaining openness to continued growth and refinement. It had shown that the love of wisdom could encompass both careful attention to particular phenomena and systematic reflection on universal principles, both rigorous logical analysis and transformative spiritual practice, both individual self-development and concern for the common good. This rich and complex tradition would continue to evolve as it encountered new challenges and opportunities in subsequent centuries, but the foundations had been securely laid, the essential methods had been established, and the fundamental questions had been clearly articulated. Future generations would build upon this inheritance in ways that the original architects could never have imagined, but they would do so using tools and insights that had been forged through centuries of careful reflection on the deepest mysteries of human existence. The ancient quest for wisdom had become a permanent part of human culture, available to anyone willing to undertake the demanding but rewarding work of philosophical inquiry. The specific conclusions that various thinkers had reached might be debated, modified, or rejected, but the underlying commitment to rational reflection, systematic investigation, and practical application would endure as long as human beings continued to wonder about themselves and their place in the vast cosmos that had given them birth. As we drift further into this exploration of philosophy's earliest stirrings, there's something almost magical about how these ancient insights continue to whisper across the centuries. The medieval world we've been examining wasn't just preserving old ideas, it was breathing new life into them, creating something that was both deeply traditional and remarkably innovative. Picture the great scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, where patient monks copied and recopied the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Augustine. Their careful hands weren't just preserving text on parchment, they were maintaining a living conversation that stretched back through time. Each stroke of the pen was an act of philosophical devotion, a recognition that these ideas mattered enough to be saved, studied, and transmitted to future generations. But something fascinating was happening as these texts traveled through different cultures and languages. When Aristotle's works were translated from Greek into Arabic, then from Arabic into Latin, each translation wasn't just a linguistic exercise, it was an interpretive act. The Islamic philosophers who first encountered these texts brought their own cultural perspectives, their own religious commitments, their own intellectual traditions to bear on these ancient insights. They weren't passive receivers, but active interpreters, finding new meanings and applications that the original authors might never have imagined. Consider how the concept of divine providence, which had roots in Stoic philosophy, was transformed as it moved through Christian and Islamic thought. For the Stoics, providence had been an impersonal, rational principle governing the cosmos. Christian thinkers, like Augustine, reimagined it as the personal care of a loving God for creation. Islamic philosophers developed their own sophisticated understandings that drew on both Greek philosophical concepts and Quranic revelation. By the time these various streams of thought began to interact in the medieval universities, the simple Stoic notion had evolved into something far richer and more complex. This process of cultural transmission and transformation reveals something profound about how philosophical ideas actually work. They're not like mathematical theorems that remain fixed once proven. They're more like seeds that grow differently depending on the soil in which they're planted. The same basic insights about human nature, cosmic order, or the good life take on new forms as they encounter different historical circumstances, cultural assumptions, and practical challenges. The medieval university system that emerged in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford represented a new kind of intellectual community. Here, for the first time in history, students and teachers from across Europe could gather to engage in sustained philosophical debate using common methods and shared texts. The scholastic method that developed in these settings, with its emphasis on systematic argumentation, careful examination of authorities, and rigorous logical analysis, created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual advancement. But what's particularly striking about these medieval thinkers is how they managed to combine intellectual boldness with spiritual humility. They weren't afraid to ask the hardest questions, to push logical arguments to their conclusions, to explore apparent contradictions between different authorities. Yet they did so within a framework of fundamental commitment to truths that they believed transcended human reason. This wasn't intellectual cowardice, but a recognition that the most important realities might require both rational investigation and something more faith, revelation, spiritual insight. Thomas Aquinas represents perhaps the pinnacle of this medieval synthesis. His Summa Theologica is one of the most ambitious intellectual projects ever undertaken. Creation, human, attempting to provide systematic answers to virtually every question that could be asked about nature, ethics, and salvation. What's remarkable is not just the scope of Aquinas' project, but the method he employed. Each major question is broken down into specific articles. Each article considers objections from multiple perspectives. Each conclusion is carefully argued and defended. This scholastic method might seem dry and academic from our contemporary perspective, but it represented a revolutionary approach to knowledge. Instead of simply accepting traditional authorities or relying on personal intuition, Aquinas insisted that important claims should be subjected to rigorous logical analysis. He was willing to consider seriously the strongest objections to his positions, often stating them more clearly than his opponents did. This intellectual honesty, combined with systematic thoroughness, created a new standard for philosophical rigor. But Aquinas wasn't just an academic philosopher working in isolation. He was a Dominican friar, deeply committed to the practical mission of teaching and preaching. His philosophical work was always oriented toward helping people understand their relationship to God and their responsibilities to one another. Even his most abstract metaphysical investigations were ultimately motivated by pastoral concerns, how to help believers live more faithful and fulfilling lives. This integration of theoretical understanding with practical application reflects a broader characteristic of medieval philosophy. These thinkers weren't interested in knowledge for its own sake, but in wisdom that could transform both individual lives and social institutions. They saw philosophy as a spiritual discipline that could purify the mind and orient the heart toward ultimate truth. Their careful, logical arguments were undertaken not just to win debates, but to clear away confusions and misconceptions that prevented people from seeing reality clearly. The medieval period also saw remarkable developments in what we might call philosophical psychology, systematic investigation of the nature of human consciousness, knowledge, and emotion. Thinkers like Aquinas developed sophisticated accounts of how the human mind works, how we acquire knowledge through sensation and reasoning, how emotions relate to rational judgment, how the will makes choices. These investigations drew on Aristotelian psychology, but extended and refined it in ways that anticipated many later developments in philosophical and scientific understanding of the mind. One particularly fascinating aspect of medieval psychological theory was its attention to what they called the interior senses, cognitive capacities that operated between simple sensation and abstract reasoning. These included what they called the common sense, that unified information from different sensory modalities, the imagination that could manipulate mental images, and the estimative power that could recognize practical significance in perceived objects. This sophisticated analysis of mental processes represented a significant advance over earlier philosophical psychology and provided conceptual tools that would influence thinking about consciousness for centuries. The medieval period also witnessed important developments in philosophical approaches to language, meaning, and logic. The recovery of Aristotle's complete logical works provided medieval thinkers with sophisticated tools for analyzing arguments and clarifying concepts. But they didn't simply accept Aristotelian logic as the final word. Instead, they extended and refined it, developing new approaches to problems that Aristotle hadn't fully resolved. Medieval logicians made significant advances in understanding the relationship between language and reality, the nature of universals and particulars, and the conditions under which statements could be considered true or false. They developed intricate theories about how words refer to objects, how general terms relate to specific instances, and how logical inference preserves truth across different types of statements. These investigations might seem highly technical, but they were motivated by urgent practical questions about how human language could be adequate for discussing divine realities that transcended ordinary experience. The question of universals, in particular, generated centuries of sophisticated debate that revealed deep issues about the nature of reality and knowledge. When we use general terms like humanity or justice, are we referring to real entities that exist independently of particular humans or just actions? Or are these merely names we use to group together similar individuals or events? Different answers to this question had significant implications for understanding everything from the nature of species in biology to the reality of moral values to the possibility of genuine knowledge about abstract truths. The philosophical debates that emerged around these questions were remarkably sophisticated, involving careful analysis of logical, metaphysical, and epistemological issues. Thinkers like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham developed positions that would influence philosophical discussion well into the modern period. Their work showed that medieval philosophy was not simply a matter of reconciling Aristotelian concepts with Christian doctrine, but involved genuine theoretical innovation and advancement. What's particularly impressive about medieval philosophical achievement is how it managed to maintain both systematic comprehensiveness and attention to particular detail. Medieval thinkers wanted to understand everything: the nature of God, the structure of the cosmos, the purpose of human life, the organization of society, the meaning of history. But they also recognized that this comprehensive understanding required careful attention to specific problems, detailed analysis of particular concepts, and rigorous examination of individual arguments. And so we've traced this remarkable journey from those first curious minds in ancient Miletus to the great medieval synthesis that would shape Western thought for centuries to come. What strikes me most profoundly is how these early philosophers weren't just asking academic questions in ivory towers, they were grappling with the same fundamental mysteries that still keep us awake at night: the nature of reality, the meaning of existence, how we should live, what makes life worth living. The love of wisdom that first stirred in those Greek colonies along the Mediterranean coast became something far more than intellectual curiosity. It became a way of life, a recognition that the unexamined life truly isn't worth living. From Thales wondering about water to Socrates, questioning everything, to the medieval scholars preserving and transforming these insights through dark centuries, each generation added their voice to this ongoing human conversation about what it means to be conscious beings in a mysterious universe. Perhaps what's most beautiful about this story is how it shows that philosophy isn't something that happened long ago and far away. It's happening right now, in your own mind, as you wonder about these very questions. The capacity for wonder, for questioning, for seeking deeper understanding. That same spark that ignited in those ancient thinkers burns in each of us. Philosophy didn't end with the ancients. It began with them, and continues wherever human beings dare to ask why, rather than simply accepting what.